Marianne, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, I'm always happy to talk to you.
You would be considered a spiritual leader for many people in the country, including many people who heard you speak at Occupy Wall Street, LA. Can you talk about what your experience was at that point in time? Were you surprised that this movement sprung up?
No, I wasn't surprised, but I was happy. I think Occupy Wall Street performed a great service for this country, harnessed a lot of energy, really took into the mainstream the very simple but very true, but before that point, in many ways obscured the idea that the vast majority of the resources in this country are in the hands of 1%. I don't think that had totally clicked in the popular mind until Occupy. And there was so much pent-up energy because of people who knew, but they didn't quite know. It was kind of inchoate. Some people absolutely knew, but they didn't feel permission to really shout it from the rooftops. Other people didn't know why all the suffering that didn't seem to come from someplace they could identify. It was like, yes. So I was and I remain a great fan.
People with your level of prominence who went to speak at the encampments. Michael Moore was at Zuccotti Park. Others were at the different encampments. Can you talk a little bit about what drew you to just be present with your physical body in the square?
I was raised. My father used to say, "Don't let the bastards get to you, little sister." Too many people get sucked into this faux sophistication, this pseudo-intellectual, pseudo-sophisticated elite perspective, whereby once they get to a certain position in terms of prominence or prestige or money, they no longer say what they know to be true in the same way. And I think the point where you have any level of platform, public audience, is when you have a sort of moral responsibility to say it louder. That's not when you should start whispering about what you know to be true. That's when you should take advantage of the fact that some people are listening and make sure you shout it from the rooftops. So the kind of perverse pleasure I get in
I love it. I love it. I know you had been working for a long time to get people who are spiritually minded, who are meditators, folks who are kind of coming online with their spirituality to actually take action for a just and moral society. Can you talk about the intersection of spirituality and political action?
If you look at the history of the United States, it's actually an aberration in this particular era that they are so divided. Because if you look at the history of the United States, spiritual and religious communities have been generative regarding the great social justice movements. Abolition really emerged from the early evangelicals in New Hampshire. Many of the women who were big leaders in the women's suffragette movement were Quakers, and it was their belief in the inner light that makes all men, women, and children equal that really spurred their desire for women's suffrage. And of course, Dr. King was a Baptist preacher. So this is new, this over-secularized left and this depoliticized spiritual and religious. Now, the spiritual and religious, when I was growing up, something was different. Something many people don't seem to recognize what happened when both Jews and Catholics became so centered in single issues. When I grew up, if there was any issue of poverty, any issue of social injustice, you always knew that the Catholics from this kind of liberation theology perspective and the Jews were going to be there. Once the Catholics grew so singularly focused, not that other Catholics aren't, but institutionally focused on abortion, and Jews became so singularly focused on the issue of Israel, it sucked a lot of energy out of the more institutionalized religious support for social justice issues, which a lot of people don't recognize what a big deal that became, not only in terms of sucking a lot of the juice out of it, but also in terms of leaving the field of social justice and left-wing issues to some secularized voices that in my opinion are overly secularized. They actually have a disdain for religious and spiritual voices, which, like I said, doesn't jive with the history of social justice movements throughout
Absolutely. One of the things about being at the park was you could feel that sense of oneness that people who are spiritually minded are, um, I don't want to use the word striving for, but maybe hoping for, striving for, being part of. That sense of community, that sense of shared oneness was alive and well in the park.
Absolutely. And a lot of people who don't contextualize their experiences or their attitudes within religious or spiritual language or understanding are living the principle, the desire to live like brothers and sisters on this planet. The desire for connectivity, the desire for community is a yearning of the heart, is a spiritual principle. And many people who talk about it don't necessarily live it. Many people who live it don't necessarily talk about it. And most of us live somewhere in between. We talk, we don't necessarily live. Other times we make it. We're all sort of stumbling towards the light here. But I think also there is the distinction to be made between issues of public morality and issues of private morality. What has happened with a lot of, particularly the Protestant churches, particularly white Protestant churches, the black churches have never been separated from recognizing their political issues, contextualized spiritually and religiously. But among white Protestants, there's been this divide. A lot of people saying, hey, I know I'm supposed to be a more loving person, but that's religion, that's spirituality, that has nothing to do with public policy. Now, traditionally, the right wing was more focused on issues of private morality, abortion, etc., and the left wing was more focused on issues of public morality. And that's why this is so diminishing, so damaging to the left when we leave out the moral argument. War and peace, forever war machine, drone warfare is a moral issue. Invading a country that did nothing to you is a moral issue. Staying at least 10 years longer than you should only because of the profits to be made to the tune of $2 trillion for the military industrial complex is a moral issue. Economic injustice is a moral issue. Environmental devastation and degradation is a moral issue. And I think if you leave out that aspect, then you leave out a lot of what truly compels people and speaks to the conscience of people. Martin Luther King said, we need coalitions of conscience. And that's why showing up at Occupy was for me not just a political, but also a spiritual and a moral statement, because to me they've never been separated. When you have 1%, when you have this kind of massive transfer of wealth into the hands of 1%, that doesn't just mean a lot of people get rich. It means a lot of people suffer. It means a lot of people are living with chronic tension and anxiety. You're harming people. We're talking about the suffering of other sentient beings. It was Victor Hugo who said, the paradise of the rich is built on the hell of the poor. And that is true in America, and we must say so.
Did Occupy actually have an effect on you personally?
I don't think it had an effect on me personally, but I think it had an effect on some people's perception of me. I had written my book, Healing the Soul of America, talking about reparations, talking about the corporatocracy, talking about wealth inequality. In 1998, that book came out. I was always very active politically. It's just, it was, my spiritual work was sort of the major, and I felt that that was where I could give my give my greatest service. But what started to happen for me, Julianna, is that I began to see so many people whose suffering, whose problems did not stem from anything they'd done wrong, or even from some act of God, but from bad public policy. And I realized that as long as these bad public policies were going to cause so much dysfunction and disease and pain and suffering in people's lives, but then the people who were causing all that suffering were just loading them onto the lap of religious figures, spiritual figures, psychotherapists, etc. That's why I'm always trying to say, no, you need to, don't just talk to me about their mental health issues. You need to stop driving them crazy. And so,
Yes, that is so
and
true.
so I had been saying this.
How do you think that Occupy has affected the spiritual community outside of those who are already in the park that day? Has it had over the last 10 years? Have you seen people getting up off the yoga mats and really getting involved? Especially now that California's on fire, you can't have an abortion in Texas after 6 weeks, and voting rights are under attack across the country.
The spiritual community in the United States, I've said for a very long time that if you have a clue as to what changes one heart, you're the one who has a clue as to what would change the world. And that for that reason, because all that the world is a collection of people, and that the people who understand the dynamics of spiritual and psychological transformation are the last people who should be sitting out the economic and social and political questions of our day. We need a transformational politics, Juliana. The transactional politics is a product of the same thinking that has destroyed our politics. So we have to move into a far more integrative approach to healing our society, just like we've embraced a more integrative approach to healing our bodies. You can't just work on external remedies. You also have to work on the internal aspect. You know, the Emancipation Proclamation, constitutional amendments, even a civil war, could abolish slavery, but they could not abolish racism. So we have to route out the thoughts, the energies that actually give rise to some of these horrors. It's a big both and. It's not either or. And that's why we need to have a coming back together of the spiritual and the political. Dr. King, when I was younger, I read every biography of Dr. King. And they all talk about what happened on the third Sunday of January in 1960. And Dr. King went on that day from what was seen as a spiritual leader who talked about politics to a political leader whose work was grounded in his spirit. And I think that template of nonviolent revolution, that is a revolution that comes from the heart, that has political effects, and the most powerful political effects in the 20th century. The nonviolent Indian independence movement that moved the British colonial empire out of India, the civil rights movement in the United States, were powerful political revolutions, but they came from the heart, they came from nonviolence, they came from the integration of those various aspects of ourself, both personally and as social and political and economic animals. And it's our turn. And I don't think anything less than that kind of integrative approach will be successful at overthrowing the worst aspects of Western materialism in its political and economic forms.
Thank you so much. Final question.
I think you're great. Yes.
There are folks in the park, in Zuccotti Park, celebrating the 10-year anniversary of Occupy Wall Street right now. What would you say to the people watching who are trying to participate from home, and to the people in the park?
Don't let anybody fool you. You are the patriotic American to be here in this park, and enjoy every minute of it. That's what I would say.
Marianne Williamson, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you. Much love to you.